Good morning. I'm Haleh Esfandiari, and I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Today's meeting, the Arab Spring, a year on how's America faring, is part of the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum of the Middle East program at the center. I would like to take this occasion to welcome Ambassador Gildenhorn, the chairman of the board of the Wilson Center, and Mrs. Alma Gildenhorn, member of the council at the Wilson Center. So that's and a supporter, both of them, of the Middle East program. Today's meeting is going to be a discussion between Aaron David Miller, distinguished scholar at the Wilson Center. I don't need to introduce Aaron. I think you all know him. I have introduced him over the years at least 8 times a year and running these meetings. But I would like to remind you that his book, The Much to Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace, is a fantastic read, but he just finished a book called Can America Have Another Great President? Nothing to do with the Middle East. So I think Aaron is maybe trying to branch out, but we won't let him at MEP. Aaron is going to introduce the other speaker. The pattern is going to be each of the speakers will speak maybe for 10 minutes, and then Aaron will comment and he'll start asking questions, and we'll open the floor to your comment and questions. Aaron, you have the floor.
Hala, thank you very much. Welcome this morning to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm a historian by training, although not by profession, and I think history is valuable. It teaches humility and perspective. The question is, how much time is required in the course of the human enterprise to make intelligent observations about the direction of events? It's an interesting question. I'm wrestling with it in this book. I mean, we've had 3 great presidents, undeniably great presidents, one a century. Were they perceived to be great in real time, or how much time had to pass in order to make a judgment with respect to their greatness? Time then becomes an important variable in assessing the state and quality of many things in life. Good marriages, good friendships, good business propositions, the course of revolutions, whether negotiated agreements actually endure. All these things are linked to the notion of time. Freedom House argues that since 1950, only 22 countries in the world have maintained their democratic character continuously. That's a very small club. Time, again, being the ultimate arbiter of whether a democratic polity can maintain its democratic structure. Now, we're trying at the moment, a year plus after a set of extraordinary changes, to assess how America is faring in the wake of these tumultuous changes that has essentially transformed the Arab world as American policymakers have known it. And I'm reminded of this story, you've heard it before, whether it's true, Kissinger tells it, in an exchange with Zhou Enlai in 1971, in one of the uncomfortable lapses in the conversation, Kissinger says to his Chinese interlocutor, "What do you think the impact of the French Revolution will be on world history?" And Zhou replies, "It's too soon to tell." And this is 1971. But I don't accept this. I do accept it, but I'm not going to accept it this morning. That is it too soon to tell with respect to these changes in the Arab world? On the narrow issue of our policy, our interests, our credibility, our image, that is to say, a year in, how is America faring in the wake of these changes? We have 3 extraordinarily talented, gifted observers. Several have policy advising experience as well. They all know Washington, they know the region, and they're going to forget all of them more than I'm ever going to know about the Arab world and Arab politics. So each will speak for 10 minutes, beginning with Nathan. I will make an annoyingly negative comment or two after they're done, and then I'm going to ask each of them a question or two, and then we will go to your questions. So, cell phones off. I guess we can start. Nathan.
Okay, thank you very much, Aaron. It's absolutely wonderful to be back here, and also very helpful to be given two very clear sets of instructions from Aaron. The first was to address his question, how's America faring? And the second, he said, avoid on the one hand, on the other hand kind of approaches. And on the one hand, I want to satisfy him. But you mentioned there was people over here with policy experience, people on the panel policy experience. I'm the one exception. I have zero. And if you ask an academic, you're not going to get an academic who doesn't argue with the question. So that's how I'm going to start. How's America faring can be kind of interpreted two ways. One is kind of how's it going for us? And in my mind, that's an irrelevant question. That's like asking people what their favorite color of the sky is. I grew up in Seattle. My favorite color is gray, but I'm powerless to impose that on Arizona. And that's, in a sense, kind of the message. We're dealing with really big historical forces here, and asking if it's good or bad for the United States, it certainly has created enormous headaches, and it will continue to create enormous headaches in the region. But the question is how we deal with it. And at the other, how are we faring? And there, what I would say is that something that should have been apparent and was apparent, I would guess, even a year ago, and that you've, Aaron, that you've brought home very forcefully, I think, in a recent column in FP, and that is that the era of policy of essentially take me to your leader, which really goes back not simply, you didn't want us to get real historical, but it certainly goes back to the 19th century, and the British and the Americans certainly followed that kind of approach, is basically over. We're now dealing with entire society. So how are we faring doing that? Well, my answer is kind of not so well, but perhaps better than can be expected. Kind of not so well. This is much harder than it should appear. Than it should appear. It looks like it should be easy, right? We have a foreign policy apparatus that certainly knows how to deal with broad political systems, with entire societies, with democratic systems, with places where leadership is constantly contested, and sometimes you have major changes of policy directions as a result of domestic political processes. We're talking about Europe, in the Middle East. We're even talking about Israel. To some extent, we've had to adjust to that with Turkey and so on. It's difficult in the Arab world, however, for us, I think, for three reasons. Number one, we have absolutely no practice at it, and this was brought home to me. I was at a session, a seminar. This was about 6 months or so ago, and an Egyptian participant who was a fairly sophisticated political observer harkened back to he was an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution and a participant in it, and he quoted a statement that I actually remembered. I don't remember it word for word, but during sort of the to and fro of the Egyptian revolution, when our policy seemed to sort of tilt one way then the other from day to day, he quoted a statement by Hillary Clinton. The exact words I don't remember, but it's something like, it's time for Mubarak to start arranging a transition, something like that. And I remembered hearing that statement and thinking, the Obama administration is doing something that I didn't think any American administration would do so easily, and that is it's basically thinking about a post-Mubarak Egypt. It is getting ready for and trying to tell the president of Egypt to get to do what he has to do to clean out his desk. And the Egyptian I was talking to said, as soon as we heard that statement in Tahrir Square, we knew the Americans were 100% behind Mubarak. And I thought about that. He had heard the exact opposite of what I'd heard. I don't know who was right, but I do know that, in a sense, what that taught me was that the way that we speak to these societies is we do not know how to speak to these societies. We knew how to speak to individual leaders. We know how to pick pick up a phone. We don't know what happens when we pick up the phone, make a phone call, we pull the old levers, and nothing happens, and therefore we have to address different constituencies. So that's the first reason. The second, Aaron asked us to be bold. I will say sometimes I think we wouldn't know an Arab institution if it hit us in the face. Okay? And what I mean by that is this: we are so used to the old patterns that when an individual leader dies, leaves, goes away, what we tend to do is simply ask, okay, who is your leader now? What is the replacement? The place I'm going to say something that has made me sometimes unwelcome in some circles in this town, but the one place where institution building was central to our policy was also a place, the Palestinian Authority, where we made very, very clear that institution building meant Salam Fayyad. It had a personal name, and Salam Fayyad became indispensable to Palestinian institution building. And my response is that any time institution building has one person's name attached to it, it's not institution building. The third reason it's very, very hard is that, I've told you why it's hard for us. It's hard for the societies themselves. Right? We have probably what I would generously call the most cockamamie transition process in world history taking place right now in Egypt. I'm actually optimistic that at the end of the process, if the process ever ends, that you will have a more democratic and more pluralist Egypt. I don't know whether it will be better for us or worse for us, but I think it will be more pluralist or democratic. But it is extremely messy, and Egypt is one of the better cases. You compare that to Libya, you compare that to Syria, you compare that to Yemen, you compare that to Bahrain. It's not even clear you've got, with the possible exception of Libya, even real clear transition processes in those other places. So the idea that we could that what you have is a clear set of institutions and processes that comes out of this, with the possible exception of Tunisia, I just don't see that as emerging. And so what is difficult for the societies themselves is going to be difficult for us to deal with. So that's why it's hard. How are we doing? Well, not as badly as we might have. I'm not going to let me sort of focus on Egypt, which I've probably been following most closely. I would actually give us decent marks for effort in at least three ways. Number one, I think we realized from the beginning the limitations of our ability to dictate the fine points of the Egyptian transition. This in Washington, this takes a form of kind of slogans that get repeated over and over. So we want to be on the right side of history and this sort of thing. But I think fundamentally, what this administration got from the beginning was that this was a process that, to some extent, should presidential elections come first? What should be in the Constitution? So on. This was kind of a process over which we only had limited control. And rather than trying to impose specific outcomes, something that would have backfired very quickly, I think we adjusted to that fairly well. Second, I think we've done something sensible and focused on a few things, on a very few things. And in the Egyptian case, it basically has to do, as far as I could tell, the way that I find out what we're focusing on is in a series of visits over the last year, I've asked Egyptians, especially in the Islamist camp, what is it that Americans ask you about when they show up? And it's three things. It's essentially Camp David, it's economics, and it's and sort of political liberties. By focusing on a few things and repeating those things over and over, I think we can't reform the Egyptian political system by ourselves, but we can probably focus on a few things which we can get out. And what we've got is a Camp David that is not yet dead, and that's a significant accomplishment. And the third thing that we've done right, at least in the Egyptian case, is learn to reach out to new actors. It's a little bit awkward. The American relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood went far more quickly and more easily in its initial stages than I ever thought would have been possible from either side. Sometimes, actually from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective, it went a little bit too far when American officials or Senator McCain started saying actually nice things about the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a little bit embarrassing to them. But we've understood fairly quickly, I think, that whatever kind of political system emerges ultimately in Egypt, this is going to have to be one where we have relationships with multiple political actors, and we've begun to build those bridges. So it may be too soon to tell how this will ultimately come out, but we're not off to as bad a start as we could have been.
Nathan, thank you very much. set a new standard for a glass half full. Ellen.
Thanks, Aaron. Well, good morning, everybody. When one is paired with Aaron, you always have to decide how many degrees more optimistic and possibly naive are you willing to be in public compared to Aaron's very sharp analysis. And this time I find myself just a little more shaded. My gray is a little bit darker than Nathan's, I think, about how do we characterize the current moment we're in. First of all, we have to look at the Middle East in a global context and the American role in a global context. Even absent the Arab Spring, this is a difficult time for American leadership, for America's role in the world as the distribution of power and of economic power is certainly being redistributed globally. So if we take those two factors, the redistribution of power internationally that suggests that the United States has less influence and leverage over world affairs than it once did, and the somewhat inward focus of the United States on its own economic well-being and a curtailing of how many resources are available for American engagement in the world, if you take those as context, when the Arab Spring came, it did mean that this was likely to be a somewhat awkward and difficult time for American policy. And while I do agree with Nathan that so far, in terms of how the American bureaucracy and the State Department in particular have thought about the transitions and have managed them so far, while they do get high marks, I don't think we can say that there are any early successes. And so we do have to think about this period as not only a time of transition for several key Arab countries, but it's a time of transition for American policy in the Middle East. It's not going to look the same in the out years. We will look back at this period and say these were not the good old days. This was a difficult period of transition. And throughout my remarks, I want to have three kind of basic core principles, if you will, underlying my analysis, and I mostly believe these principles are true, but there are some exceptions. One is it's not about us. The Arab Spring is truly a spontaneous, authentic phenomenon that has historic consequence, but the United States was not the principal driver, beneficiary, or shaper of these events. The second is that we are in a period where it's clear that there are now two Middle Easts, a prosperous, relatively stable, non-democratic, oil-exporting Middle East, and a populist, democratizing, economically stressed and water-stressed, among other things, a Mediterranean Middle East, and that in the age of great transparency, it's hard for the United States to have an overarching Middle East strategy that successfully embraces both of these regions. So we end up having two discourses, and they play off each other in ways that sometimes make it, I think, very difficult for American decision makers. I would say that in addition to this bifurcation of the Middle East that in a way has always been there but has been sharpened, there is a sort of tension between where our heart is and where our head is. That I think there is still mostly in the American elites, in government and non-government elites, some sense of solidarity and identification with the new Democrats of the region, and truly a belief that the Middle East has an opportunity to catch up with the rest of the world and to have more representative government, et cetera. So that's where that there is a tug of deep meaning, of values, principles, and meaning that draws us to this Mediterranean Middle East. But our heads and our sort of near-term interests and the sort of affairs of state and the things we have to manage on a day-to-day basis make our partnerships with the Gulf countries, with the non-democratic countries, and with the countries that truly think the Arab Spring was a very, very bad thing, we still want to do a lot of business with them, and we are deepening and expanding our relations with those countries. There's now a U.S. Gulf Security Forum that Secretary Clinton just attended, and so we are not addressing the same themes in our relations with those countries as we are with the Mediterranean. And the third principle that sort of animates me is sometimes less is more. That we do have to just adjust to an age where the United States is not necessarily the largest aid donor, where the United States' presence in some of these countries really does have to be scaled back. It will be scaled back in part by our own financial and budgetary realities and requirements, but partly it will be because at least some countries, and I think Egypt is really a stunning case here, the atmosphere will be less receptive to a robust American presence, and I think we have to just start to acknowledge that. Let me talk about why I think Egypt is the hardest case. I'm very intrigued that Nathan is encouraged and sees a trajectory in Egypt that will have a relatively happy ending. I'm deeply worried that what is happening in Egypt today vis-a-vis the United States, that they are associating the end of dictatorship with a repudiation of the American role in Egypt. I think this is very damaging and even frightening from a U.S. interest perspective for the long run. It does feel a little bit like the first year of the Iranian Revolution, which I'm sure many, not all people in this room will remember, where the association of the Shah with the United States became an embedded principle of the revolution, that it was an identity value of the revolution. It wasn't just a secondary factor. It was one of the core ways to describe why the revolution. Certainly the protesters of Tahrir Square were not acting in some passion of anti-Americanism, but the way the rest of the Egyptian system is now behaving, it has turned out to be convenient for various players in Egypt to beat that anti-American drum to the point where it will have some structural and deeper consequences for America's engagement. And if we're not successful in redefining and reestablishing a healthy relationship with Egypt, that will certainly have spillover effects in other parts of the region. So I'm quite worried that the snapshot of the present in Egypt has some very sober signals for what might look like the long term. Now, let's acknowledge that what we have today in Egypt is various forms of interim governments, and that we don't yet have the Muslim Brothers or the whatever coalition of parties will be the dominant force in Egyptian politics. We don't know if the presidency is going to be held by the same party as the parliament. We don't know what the executive branch of Egyptian government is going to look like yet. So maybe some of these things are transitory, but it's possible that it is appealing to a kind of core populism in Egypt that will be difficult for us to manage. But the upside, Aaron asked us to find the good news. I do think that Tunisia and Libya are two very interesting examples where the receptivity towards America's engagement is much stronger and more positive. The Tunisians are so relieved that we care about them again. After many years where we thought we patted the Tunisians on the head and said, you're an economic success story, you can cooperate with us on counterterrorism, but beyond that, you're really in the European sphere of influence, not the American. We've now fallen in love with the Tunisians again, a modernizing, homogeneous country that did the right things demographically, as Rich Sincata will tell us, that it's, that they have many things going for them. And the United States has been relieved that there's one of these countries in transition that very much wants to partner with the United States. So while some of our democracy-promoting organizations may have to regroup and really scale back their presence in a place like Egypt, they are being welcomed in Tunisia and in Libya as well. Libya is a scarier case because they're basically reinventing state structures, institutions. We don't know how decentralized the system will be. But both of those cases, I think, stand in pretty sharp contrast to Egypt. And then on my less is more principle, I really do think the United States has to rethink its business model in how we engage. We're all believing so much, and we in the civil society sector believe that it's not just state-to-state relations that determine America's role and presence in the region, but there is a lot of society-to-society interaction, and certainly we should be I do believe that some of the work that was done through democracy-promoting and human rights organizations over the years did help shape the worldview and the capabilities of the Tahrir Square activists. So in a very indirect way, the United States did contribute to the success of the Egyptian revolution. But right now, the atmosphere is quite toxic for the notion that we would somehow think that we're going to help engineer these democratic transitions. And so I think that this is a time of some deep discomfort. We literally may have to shut these operations down. We obviously bailed out the people who had been caught in the Egyptian legal net, but it may be that we are looking at a very serious restructuring of how we engage with civil society in the countries that have told us we're not welcome. It's not unlike how the problems we face in China, where a non-democratic state is wanting to control a reform process on its own terms and is deeply suspicious of what the international community is trying to do. They do see these activities as subversive. So in the case of Egypt, we have this peculiar situation where, in theory, the pro-democracy folks won, but they don't feel that way right now. And it is difficult to see how the people who are still advocates of democratic change in Egypt and very much want the military to step back from public life, how they can embrace the return of American or European and international NGOs. It may not fit into the public discourse for now. So I think there is a big restructuring that the United States has to be agile enough and responsive enough to the changed environment to figure out a different business model. So let me just say a few words about U.S. aid to the region. It's certainly in the past been one of the instruments of American influence and engagement. I've looked closely at what the administration has proposed for fiscal year 13, and there are slight increases, an increase of actually about $1 billion region-wide, but of an $8 billion total that they're asking for the Middle East, 5 of that $8 billion goes immediately to pre-existing security relationships. So 5 of the $8 billion immediately goes to Egypt, Israel, Iraq, the Iraqi police training program, and very little of it is really available for new and expanded economic promotion activities for the countries in transition. In fact, we are cutting back on some education and health and sort of basic development services kinds of activities, and the adjustments are not as dramatic as one might imagine. You may know the administration has asked for $770 million in a special transition fund, a new initiatives fund for the Middle East, and hasn't yet allocated that money, but at least some of it will be going for security-related things and not necessarily for things that would be stimulating job creation and other things that the region needs very badly. 3 last thoughts. In terms of where some of the true challenges are, where I don't think the United States has yet figured out the course it needs in the near to medium term, I do think we have a true dilemma on our hands with the culture wars that are emerging in the countries in transition, particularly with respect to women. In Afghanistan, we know that one of the tugs at the heartstrings of how we get out of the war in Afghanistan is, can we walk away from the predicament that girls and women face in Afghanistan, when we had made that a very prominent feature of our engagement there. Across the Middle East, and I know the Tunisia case the best, secular women are truly feeling on the defensive and very, very nervous, and are turning to to Western countries and saying, what are you going to do for us? How can you help protect us? But these are deep culture wars that are happening within societies, and it's not at all clear that the United States will be able to do much about it. The other is a leadership deficit in the region. What we are seeing in an age of pluralism, post-dictatorship, that all feels good, that power's not concentrated in one person, but we don't see the emergence yet of real champions, of people who have some charismatic leadership quality that can pull together and create new consensus in these societies in transition. I think that we can't have it both ways. We don't want necessarily the return of the strongman model, but we certainly want to see competent and effective leaders. And the last is public-private partnerships. The Obama administration has been crystal clear that the real immediate requirement is economic stimulus. But neither our government nor the governments in the region really know how to partner and mobilize the private sector. The private sector, in some ways, are global actors, not acting on behalf of a single sovereign state, and their interests are not necessarily perfectly aligned. They also have very little patience to deal with weak governments. So when we see Gulf private sector actors, for example, say that there is money that they are willing to invest in the countries in transition, the reality is they don't really want to have to deal with these weak governments, these indecisive governments. So we've got a little problem here. We can speak the rhetoric of public-private partnerships, but the reality is, in fact, very, very difficult. I'll stop there.
Ellen, thanks. Very thoughtful. Michael?
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me here, Aaron. And it's fascinating to listen to two very good and compelling presentations. And I'm struck by how much I agree with the previous two speakers, especially in their analysis about what's happening in the region and what the implications are for the United States. For me, the question about how is America faring 1 year in is sort of not really an adequate question. I'm sorry, Aaron, but it's because I think of this in terms of America's interests. Why do we care? None of us really spoke about Tunisia before. Why do we suddenly care about what's happening in Tunisia? I think there is a good reason, but I don't think it's self-evident. And so I think we need to, in my mind, assess this question with respect to what are the things we care about in the Middle East, what are we trying to accomplish in the Middle East. And there's certainly been a lot of changes in this region. Maybe not as much change as is sometimes advertised. I think in some places you've had a total change. You've had a total change in Libya, certainly. Where not only a leader but an entire system has been swept away. You've had, I guess, a semi-total change in Egypt, although I think that remains to be seen, because you still have the military essentially in charge, although maybe they'll decide not to be in charge anymore come this summer. But in other places, look, Syria, Yemen, wherever you want to sort of point to, the changes are maybe more superficial than advertised. And I think the jury is still out on what exactly will change in these countries. And so I think between our sort of cosmic focus about the Arab Spring and our sort of microscopic focus on what's happening today in Syria and where are the troops and where aren't the troops, it is possible after a year to point to some fundamental changes in the Middle East. But I think we have to start by looking at what has changed about American interests, what has changed about what we're trying to accomplish. And I think the basic answer to that is nothing, really. I don't think our interests have changed in the Middle East. And when I teach students, international relations students, I basically encourage them to think about foreign policy making as sort of a hierarchy. You have interests, there are obstacles to those interests, you formulate a strategy, and as part of that strategy you use various tactics and tools and so forth. I think the first part of that, as I said, interests, haven't really changed. And we're still looking at what I would call sort of the big five interests in the Middle East. You've got energy, you've got the free flow of commerce, you've got nonproliferation, you've got counterterrorism, and I would add economic development and political development. Everyone would quibble about this list. I'm sure everyone up here would have a different list. But I look at those and I don't see many changes. But the rest of that hierarchy I mentioned is, in my mind, really in disarray. The strategy we're pursuing is just the old strategy, and we're just trying to kind of jury-rig it to a new situation, in a sense. The tactics and policy tools tend to be our focus, assistance, our FMF in Egypt, should we meet with this party or that party? Well, those are interesting tactical questions, but I think those are not really the key issue right now. The key issue is, again, going back, that strategy. And I think to update our strategy in the Middle East, we need to recognize we have a new context and new obstacles. And let me talk about that very briefly. In fact, I want to talk about, I think, mainly three new obstacles to achieving our interests in the Middle East. The first is that internal politics matter, and we don't understand internal politics in these countries. And I think this is something both speakers pointed to as well. As Aaron pointed out in his most recent article, in the old days of U.S. policymaking in a place like Egypt, you had maybe one or two or three individuals really who you spoke to. You'd pick up the phone, you'd speak to Omar Suleiman, you'd speak to Tantawi, who of course is still there and is still on the other end of the phone for U.S. officials. You maybe speak to a couple of other people. This is true not only in Egypt but in many, many countries. It's still true in many of those countries today. Places like Saudi Arabia and other places which haven't really been touched in a significant way by the Arab Spring. I think certainly in places like Egypt this just isn't true anymore. These countries now have, apparently, at least for now, real internal politics. They have real domestic politics. And those politics matter. And it's important to get to know those politics like we do in places like Europe or places like Asia or, frankly, places like Israel, which is right next door. And it's true, as Nathan said, that our diplomats in the Middle East don't have experience doing this, and it's hard for them. And I think the inclination is, again, to think about the old way we did business and try to replicate that. Who are the 2 or 3 key people in this new Egypt? I don't think we can approach it that way. We need to rethink the model, rethink the approach to these places, and we need to recognize that not only do internal politics matter in terms of understanding these countries, they matter in terms of the issues which are important to us. So whether it's Camp David, whether it's economics, whether it's political values, those 3 issues that I think Nathan mentioned, these are not just foreign policy issues. These are not just issues for discussion with visiting American officials. These are political footballs inside these countries and may end up being determined solely on sort of domestic considerations. This is sometimes hard for us to accept when it comes to making foreign policy in the Middle East, that it's domestic issues which will govern something and not foreign policy considerations, that even foreign policy issues will be governed by domestic considerations. Aaron writes about this all the time when it comes to Israel, and it can be one of the frustrating things about dealing with Israel. And I think we may see that develop in some of these other places. The second new obstacle, look, is that these governments, I agree with something that Ellen said, which is that these governments are going to be more anti-Western, more anti-American, more anti-Israel. And to me, this is a function of the fact that we, rightly or wrongly, are associated in the minds of Egyptians, for example, of many Egyptians, not all Egyptians, with these oppressive regimes which they've overthrown because of our aid relationships, because of our political relationships. And in many ways, Israel's caught in the same bind, that these peace treaties, for example, between Egypt and Israel, are not seen as, right now as strategic achievements for the Egyptian people. They're seen as bargains that the old rulers made, often against the interests of their people. That's the narrative inside these countries. Look at the discussion right now in Egypt when it comes to, for example, the gas deal, which was just canceled. They see this gas deal as a sort of artifact of the Mubarak era, which was not in the interest of the Egyptian people. Now, in my mind, this is pretty far from the truth. The Israel-Egypt treaty, for example, was a strategic achievement not just for Israel, but for Egypt, and I think bought Egypt a long period of peace and prosperity. I think that natural gas deal, which came about in the year 2000 with a decision of the Egyptian cabinet, was also in Egyptian interests. But there's been no effort inside Egypt to sell those things as strategic achievements for Egypt. In fact, what you've had is this kind of cold peace and this strategic relationship operating at a very high level. And Israeli officials are also guilty, for example, of really only dealing with 2 or 3 people in the Mubarak regime and not dealing with the broader society, though perhaps it was harder for them than it would have been for us. But while you had that high-level strategic relationship going on, underneath that, you had in, for example, the Egyptian state media, not only no effort to sell that relationship, but just the worst kinds of sort of anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And so you're starting from a place which is not advantageous. And that cold peace which reigned, may not turn into war, but I think it's going to get a lot colder before it turns into something more positive. The third obstacle I see, and maybe this is a little bit different than what Ellen and Nathan pointed to, is that I see a higher risk now of conflict within this region. And why do I see that? When I look at the old order in the Middle East, to put it in very simplistic terms, we thought of it as 2 axes, essentially. And I know this word axis is now not a sort of a good word to use, but I'm going to use it anyway. 2 blocks, let's say. That's a better word. You had one sort of pro-Western bloc or pro-U.S. bloc, or at least one that was aligned with the United States. And that was, Israel. It was a lot of Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others, which were essentially our allies in the region. Then you had this other bloc, the resistance bloc, as they'd probably want to call themselves, Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and so forth. And we all sort of could understand this order and operate within it. But that's collapsed now. And I think that the key sort of thing which bound our bloc together, which was our engagement and our leadership in the Middle East, has also started to fade, in part for the reasons that Ellen mentioned, and I think in part out of conscious choice by the United States. And there is no clear answer to what new order, is going to take the place of this old order. Certainly there is no global power that's going to step in the place of the United States. And there is no regional power. There's no local country within the region that's going to step into a leadership role. And instead, what I would say is that we now have a number of countries which are grappling with domestic problems, but which may eventually use external issues, external conflict even, to unite their peoples or to get past those domestic problems. And you know, Aaron mentioned that he studied history. I didn't study history, but I guess I know enough about it to know that this has happened before. And I don't think that any of these other states are going to easily recognize, say, the preeminence of another. So Egypt is not going to look to Turkey. Turkey is not going to look to Iran. A new Syria may not look to Saudi Arabia, for example. In fact, Amr Moussa, who's one of the leading presidential candidates in Egypt, gave a very interesting interview where he, you know, said some nice things about Turkey, but basically said quite explicitly, you know, the Egyptians are not going to be led by Turks. And I think it's important that we understand there are regional dynamics within the Middle East which have nothing to do, as Ellen said, with the United States or with the relations with the West, which may contribute to or fuel some disorder in this region, although it's not clear what the spark will be at this point for any of that. So given these obstacles, I think we need to update our strategy. We can't simply say, well, the context has changed, but let's keep pursuing the same strategy as though it hasn't, which I sort of think is what we do. We have a tendency to think of the old model, the old Middle East, and think of the new this sort of new region, the new context, in terms of incremental changes from what came before, as opposed to just taking a fresh look entirely at the region. And I would point to just, let's see, three things that I think we need to do to sort of write our strategy here a little bit. One is that I do think there is a need for American leadership in this region. We tend to assume, I think naturally, that what we do is at the center of everything. So every statement made by the Secretary of State, every aid decision we make is maybe big news amongst us sort of Middle East analysts in Washington. And we kind of assume, I think, that it's guiding the conversation or the narrative in the Middle East as well. But I don't think that that's necessarily true. The perception I've picked up in my travels to the region is not that we're at the center of things, but that we're at the sidelines. So when we make a non-committal statement on Syria, it's not good news or bad news, it just isn't news. And that's something which is not, well, it's not good news for us, let's say. And instead of, I think, taking a firm position on many issues, we've seemed sort of befuddled every time a new crisis is broken out, as though it's the first. And this is a little bit strange. It's as though we're acting without a set of clear principles or strategy, whether the principles that Ellen laid out or any principles at all. But our approach is more sort of finger to the wind. You know, what's going on, for example, in Egypt. I mean, we made a historic statement when the Obama administration called for Mubarak to step down. But one reason I think that Egyptians might have been confused was that the statements the day before and the day before that and the day before that were all different. And so, you know, we tend to kind of pick out one and then forget about the others, which I don't think the people in these countries do. And I think that our declining influence risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Power and influence are in no small part about perception. And I think as people increasingly perceive us as less relevant to what's happening in the region or on the sidelines, it will become true, and we'll have to work that much harder to assert our influence or to assert our power in the Middle East. And that takes me back to our interests and to advance and defend those interests, which still, despite all the talk about a pivot to Asia and so forth, are pretty critical interests, which is why the Middle East still is on the front pages every day. And I think we need to, again, recognize that in our search, in our look around the region for other partners to somehow lead, for example, Turkey, it's simply not going to happen. I don't think the Turks are going to lead in Syria. They're not going to lead the region, as I mentioned before. And there's a sense that I get, looking at what's happening right now, where we're all kind of looking at one another, waiting to see who's going to take the initiative, and yet no one's raising their hand to do so. The second thing is I think we need a little help from our friends in this region. You know, it's understandable maybe that we sort of muffed these Arab Spring countries because a lot of this took us by surprise. You know, no one really expected what happened in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya to happen in those countries. But why we have so poorly handled our relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Israel, is a lot more perplexing. You know, we've in a time where we have seen some of our close allies sort of fall by the wayside, why have we kicked others to the wayside, is a question I would ask. And in this time of tumult, it's not just the United States which is reassessing the region, which is having a conversation like this one. it's all of our allies as well, whether the Turks or the Emiratis or the Saudis. And I think we need to understand that one thing that they're reassessing is their relationship with us. Look, for example, at the UAE's decision to kick out NDI right after we made this decision about the aid waiver in Egypt. Well, they're sort of going through this reassessment about what's the nature of their relationship with us. And I think that we need to act now to influence that debate and that deliberation within these countries. And I think that a lot of that will come down to how are we acting on issues like Syria? How are we acting on issues like Iran? Are we seen as sort of tending to our alliances or not? What is the role of, say, democracy promotion in our policy? Which leads me to my third point, which is that, in my mind, democracy promotion and political reform are actually needed more now than ever. So I wouldn't like to see us sort of take a back seat or have no opinion on, for example, what's happening inside Egypt as they're forming their new democracy. That said, I agree that we can't impose solutions. But look, if it was controversial before that we should promote democracy in this region, I think now we have no choice because these states are undergoing transition and they'll end up in a new place, and we have an interest in what that new place is. We all, I think, at this point agree that an election is not a democracy, and that there is a real risk in some of these places of ending up not with democracy, but with a tyranny of the majority. Natan Sharansky, I think, put this very well when he talked about the differences in how people see democracy, how different societies at different stages see democracy. And there's a big gap between the moment where you go out and demand your rights, you go out and sort of claim your rights, and the moment you want to protect the rights of everyone in your society. And I think this gets at what Ellen was talking about when it comes to women. Are these societies going to stand up not just for the rights of the majority, but for the rights of individuals within the societies? And I think we have an interest in sort of promoting liberal values in these places to the extent that we're able to do so. And I think there are big open questions in these places. For example, these new Islamist majorities, are they compatible with liberalism or not? I was discussing with my co-panelists beforehand an op-ed that was in the Wall Street Journal by Ruel Gerecht, where he makes the case that perhaps these Islamist parties are compatible with liberalism. I'm not sure that I know the answer to that, and it's an open debate, and I guess we'll see. But I think the important thing is not, for me, is not that we be pro or anti-Islamist, but that we be pro-liberalism, and that we continue to stand up for those policies regardless of who's in power. And I think that we need to do this as well in countries which remain autocratic. We need to push for political reform so that we see not revolution in these countries, but evolution in these countries. Because what's happened, I think, in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya is not the outcome that we want. We wouldn't have wanted to see what happened in Egypt to happen in the way that it did. We would have wanted to see a much more orderly transition to something that is far more democratic than what Mubarak presided over. And as just a last point on this question of democracy promotion, I have to say that, for Pete's sake, we need to get out of the embassies that we have in these countries. Part of the problem that we had in the past was that we really sort of only saw those officials that came to us. We saw only a very limited, narrow circle of officials. I remember once when I was a young diplomat going to Cairo, and it was maybe my second time ever in Cairo, and I had some friends who lived in a kind of peripheral neighborhood in Cairo. They weren't working for the U.S. government. And I remember telling the folks at the embassy that I was going to go drive out or take a cab out to this neighborhood and have dinner with these friends. And they said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, why can't I do it? Is there a security warning, or is it this area where officials are not allowed to go? And they said, well, no, but we just never go there. It's not a safe place for Americans to go. And I said, well, I'm going to go. And I went, and I, of course, had a very nice time and had very interesting conversations with Egyptians about what was happening in Egypt. And of course, this is not a place where American diplomats ventured or ever heard the opinions of people who, many of them probably ended up in Tahrir Square later. And that's really something we need to rectify. These fortress embassies that we have in these countries may serve one purpose, but I'm not sure that they help us understand these societies or the politics in these countries. And if we're really going to promote our values of liberalism and democracy in these countries, I think we need to understand these countries better. So I'm going to leave it at that. I mean, yes, I do have lots of on the one hand, on the other hand opinions, and yes, it's going to take these revolutions a long time to unfold. But I don't think we can use that as a cop-out when it comes to our policy. I think people in the Middle East need to know where we stand in terms of our commitment to the region, in terms of what exactly it is we're committed to. And right now, I don't think they do. I'm not sure we do either.
Thank you. Three really fascinating, brilliant presentations. Let me just say a few things, and then I have a question for each of our panelists. I think in 25 years of government, I wrote countless memos which essentially were contained three options. One, the breakthrough option, which wasn't likely to happen. Second, the breakdown option, which wasn't likely to happen. And then the third option, which more frequently did happen, which is the muddle-through option. And I suspect amidst all this confusion that I'm not predicting catastrophe, and Michael was right to identify what our interests are. They're arguable, but your policy has to serve the interests, and they have to be clear and cohesive. I'm not predicting catastrophe here. I'm also not predicting transformation. My judgment, what's happening in the Arab world right now are transactional arrangements rather than transformational. You don't see revolutions anywhere. What you see is competition for power and vacuums. Political space opened up. That space is now occupied by the best disciplined, most organized, most effective actors in the systems. These are not transformation. They could prove to be transformational, but in no case do you have a true turning of the system. This is not Tehran in 1979. It's not St. Petersburg. It's not the French Revolution. It's not even the American Revolution. These are transactions, and it'll be interesting to see the way it plays out. Number two, I worry because great powers, particularly this one, and I don't know the Arabs as well as I know us, and I don't claim to, but I know us very well. Great powers do not manifest the kinds of agility and tactical dexterity that is required under these circumstances. They do not. It requires a great power a long time to divest itself of relationships that are half a century old. For America, the Arab world was divided into two kinds of authoritarians for half a century. I call them the acquiescent authoritarians, the Mubaraks, the Ben Alis, and the adversarial authoritarians, the Gaddafis, the Saddams, the Assads. They're all gone, or even in the case of Assad, although who knows how long it will take, if ever, we're witnessing a profound transformation. And America will be slow, just as the Russians have been slow to give up on the Assads. It's almost illogical. Great powers don't give up on investments easily. They just don't. We're still involved in the devil's bargain, arguably, in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and even with the SCAF. The Secretary of State has to seek a waiver in order to release part of the FMF assistance to Egypt. That can be perceived as an undemocratic act at a time when Egypt is democratizing. So, no, we don't pivot. There'll be no quick and easy pivots here. Number three, and I'm just reporting here, I'm not suggesting we change our policies or campaigning, but American policy, in my judgment, on the core issues has not changed in 30 years. And I would argue they probably won't change. Our policies toward Iran, toward weapons of mass destruction, toward Israel, toward Gaza, toward Hamas, toward democratization will make us cautious, incremental, transactional players. We are not going to be transformative. There's not going to be some profound change in the way we deal with Israel or Hamas or the Palestinian issue, even if the president is reelected, which he's likely to be for a second term. And just another couple points. We talk about hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds, but that's really not a logical approach. You don't change the wrapping on the package in hopes of convincing the beneficiaries of your gift that the contents of the package have fundamentally been altered. It's not hearts and minds at all. It's minds and hearts. You appeal to people's basic logic and their interests. Then the hearts follow. But our policies, and again, I'm just reporting here, our policies on core issues are universally not liked from one end of the Arab and Muslim world to the other. And frankly, they're not going to change. Great powers can be hypocritical. They can pursue contradictory policies. We talk to the worst kinds of insurgent groups in Afghanistan and Iraq, in large groups that have been responsible for killing Americans, because we talk to them because American men and women are deployed in harm's way. We won't talk to Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm not suggesting that we do. I'm simply pointing out the logical contradiction as it appears to many people in the region. And those policies are not going to change, in my view. Finally, we're dealing with, I think, we are witnessing a profound transformation in the political environment in which this country is operated in this region. And the hardest thing for analysts is to try to sort through when something changes. I think this really is the beginning of a profound transformation. And I agree with all of the panelists here. What is going to replace the structure that we've dealt with for a half century or more is simply unclear. Strong men and women, probably not. And by the way, in the gender issue, the Arab Spring has not been kind. Women have gone from being marginalized to being excluded. And this is a huge issue, it seems to me, for any society that hopes to democratize, to take sufficient advantage of the human resources that exist within it. How can you function? How can you be a truly productive society if half of your population occupies some zone somewhere else? This is a critically important question, and our Secretary of State deserves enormous credit for continuing to push on this particular issue. So, I'll close by saying the following. I do not see on the core issues that constitute American interests, energy security, peacemaking, Camp David in particular, security relationships. I don't see any quick, catastrophic breakdowns, but I do not see a reset either. And at a time when we are neither feared, admired, or respected in this region as much as we need to be and should be, based on our interests, I think Michael has laid them out well, I think it's going to be an extremely difficult and uncertain period. Let me just ask a question of each of them. I noticed, and certain phrases caught my attention. Nathan, Camp David is not dead yet, quote unquote. Since that issue occupies such a centrality in Washington's view of the region, when you say it's not dead yet, what do you mean exactly?
In some ways, it could be, in one weird way, you said I was sort of glass half full person. In one weird way, it's more alive than it ever was. But it's also, I think, deeply threatened. Here's how it's more alive. The Camp David peace treaty was a peace treaty between leaders. On the Egyptian side, that leader and his successor are now gone from the political scene. And an awful lot, I mean, the fact that this was a cold peace, I think, like you used that phrase, absolutely. But something interesting has happened in Egyptian politics over the past year. Now, remember, this is the glass half full part. What's the alternative? Nobody has one. And those forces that were very deeply critical of the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, most particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, have basically said they accept Egypt's existing international obligations. Now, I've interviewed various members of the Brotherhood about this, and some of them utter that sentence with great ease. And some of them, it looks like they're undergoing root canal when they're saying it. Okay? But they say it. And one of the reasons they say it is because they understand they set off alarm bells internationally. This is one of the ways to stop those alarm bells from ringing. And the other reason I think they say it is because what is the alternative? Is the alternative war? Nobody in Egypt wants war. So what you have right now is a consensus in Egypt, I think, that's fairly broad, that says We don't like the terms of that treaty. There's certain things we want, especially the economics. If there's anything economic in that treaty, there's almost axiomatic in the Egyptian understanding it must be bad for us. We want to sort of take up the issue of demilitarization of Sinai and so on. But fundamentally, these are things that have to be negotiated. And so there is, in that sense, in this weird way, an insinuation of Camp David in Egyptian politics that never existed before. So that's the glass half full. Now the glass half empty. Democratic politics, I think, will now matter. So on a day-to-day basis, what that means right now is that Egyptian-Israeli relations are as bad as they've ever been, but they're basically still workable, and those countries are still at peace. What happens in a crisis? And that's when I think Israel will find a very, very different Egypt to deal with than, say, it dealt with in December 2008, than it dealt with over the issue of Hamas before that. In all different kinds of ways, Israel will have to be dealing with a different Egypt. My own sense is this is a big problem for the United States. It's a real big headache for the United States. It's an existential question for Israel. And they have an opportunity now, I think, to try and address that. I'm not sure they're going to take it. My sense is that in Israel that senses existential concerns is not necessarily in a mood to start sort of thinking like, how do we renegotiate this treaty? So that's why I say it's not. I don't know what the future will bring. It seems to me that I could envision all kinds of regional crises where that Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty begins to fray. But for at least for the present, I think it's actually safer than it was before.
So the logic then is the Egyptian public now owns the treaty. And part of that ownership is creating a new normative standard in which Islamists, for reasons of practicality, have come to not embrace it, but acquiesce in it?
Yeah, I think acquiesce is probably a good word.
All right, so then one additional question. Now, so as goes the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, so goes the prospects of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement. That is to say, if the Israelis perceive that relationship fraying or in jeopardy, what is their view likely to be of another deal with the Palestinians? In other words, is that a consideration in terms of the impact of the evolution of in Egyptian politics of the Camp David experience, or do you see the two not connected?
I think they're connected. The prospects for an Israeli-Palestinian deal were nil before this. So it's not as if, I mean, the phrase peace process has zero meaning in the region except to provoke kind of nostalgia among some and laughs among others. So it's not as if it killed anything. What I think it does mean is that when the Israelis manage their relations with the Palestinians, they won't find Egypt, over the short term, they won't find Egypt the helpful partner that they did in the past. And in fact, if there's any Egyptian role right now, it's, and it's limited, it's focused on the issue of Palestinian reconciliation, something that would give the Israelis real problems. I mean, the Egyptians are not an active player right now, but if they become more assertive, that's likely to be the direction in which they go.
Ellen, the GCC, the bell hasn't tolled yet for any. The Kings have fared much better than the presidents of the phony republics. I mean, and there are many reasons for that, I'm sure. Fortunately for us, I guess, we haven't seen a disruption in a major oil producer, with the exception of Libya, and that seemed to have worked out okay. But when you talk about a new balance being created and the Americans reinvesting in the GCC, can you elaborate a little bit on that theme?
Sure. With the exception of Bahrain, I think U.S. relations with the more stable oil-producing countries are going well. I do think the Gulf Arabs share some of the same misgivings about whether U.S. policy is coherent enough and whether we abandon Mubarak. They reacted very poorly to that. And they're not quite sure that we know what the strategic thrust of our own policy is towards the countries in democratic transition. But here's where another disconnect comes that we haven't really addressed. I think the unifying factor for our relations with the Gulf is Iran, is the Iranian threat. It's not the Arab Spring. It's not the transformation of Arab political culture. So we have one issue on which, in theory, we share at least some of the strategic goals, even though we might disagree tactically. I think the Gulf Arabs are also squirming a bit under pressure from us to comply with this amazing array of sanctions and punitive measures against Iran because, as we all know, the Gulf Arabs actually try to have a somewhat more nuanced policy towards Iran. They have Iranian diplomatic presence in their country. They want to maintain trade with Iran, and they want to rely on the United States to do the heavy lifting when it comes to preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power. So they are dependent on us. They a little bit don't trust our own policy processes. But they are still engaged with us. So I think this strategic forum is an interesting new development in U.S. relations with the region. A lot of it has to do with kind of clarifying and expanding interoperability of defense systems. I mean, some of it is very operational and tactical with respect to defensive measures vis-a-vis Iran, but I think it has a deeper political meaning. Now, Bahrain, if the United States were to decide over time that Bahrain's instability really does compel us to think about relocating the Fifth Fleet, if the bargain that you referred to vis-a-vis Bahrain really comes under question, and I think it could. And there are certainly people in the U.S. military that say, my goodness, I hope we're considering alternatives, and look, people have looked at other ports in the region, et cetera, because there is a cost to us to sticking with the monarchy in Bahrain. It really does undermine the logic of our human rights policy overall, et cetera. So I think that it's possible that Bahrain is going to force us to shift a bit. And I think that will be yet another source of tension with the Saudis. But we have had episodes of tremendous tension with the Saudis, and yet the long-term strategic compatibility, there's still some core shared interest there.
Michael, the notion of American leadership and flexibility, I mean, we need to stand up for what we believe in. We need to promote a liberal order. I know you made a reference to Syria, which is a separate issue. My question to you is this. We've gotten ourselves into trouble when our words and our rhetoric outstrip our capacity to do what we say we're going to do. I mean, that I think was part of the problem in the Obama administration for the first 18 months or so. So on the issue of democratization, how do we stand up for what we believe in and encourage political reform if, in fact, nothing changes or our actions actually contradict our principles? Egypt and Bahrain are the two examples that I'm thinking about. Syria offers another notion of where words go way beyond our capacity to bring about results. But in Egypt, how do you square that particularly? How do you demonstrate leadership and push reform if, in fact, you can't fundamentally change anything? Military assistance to Egypt would have been a lever. We've chosen, presumably, not to use it.
Thanks, and I think it's a great question. And I think that I think we need to start out by saying that, look, I talked about our interests in this region. I do think that, as I said, economic development and political development are an interest of the United States in this region. So to me, it's not a conflict, as many people say, between interests and values. I don't think that's the right way to look at it, and I think as soon as you put it into that framework, sort of the hardened sort of realists in Washington can start to sneer at this idea of democracy promotion. I don't think we should, because I think that these things very much benefit the United States in a real way, not just in a kind of psychic way. And it's also important to recognize that interests are frequently in conflict with one another. So it's not just this interest that's in conflict with some other interest. Its interests are frequently in conflict with one another, and you always need to manage these conflicts in a smart way. And so that's the context for my answer. And I think that, look, you do it, first of all, it's a long slog, I think, and you can't allow your rhetoric and your promises to get ahead of your willingness to actually act or follow through. And I think that you said that this has happened with the Obama administration. I think it happened with the Bush administration as well. In fact, I think that it tends to happen frequently with the United States, where we raise expectations above the level that we're actually willing to meet. And I think that it's important that this be not a sideshow, not an afterthought, but a real part of the conversation with all of these regimes, and a meaningful part of the conversation. Something we are willing to put our leverage and our influence behind, but it's not the only part of the conversation. I think we need to be realistic with both the regimes and the peoples about that, that we're trying to balance our interests just as their governments are and just as they are. And hopefully having a realistic conversation about that will result in will yield a better result, let's say, than we've had in the past. The interesting thing to me is that, look, when we were doing this in earnest, when I was in government, for example, in the Gulf states, the discussion about political reform was a real part of the discussion. It wasn't an afterthought. And we pressed it with the Saudis, we pressed it with the other Gulf states, which had very little political space. And to me, the effect of this was that they had to pay attention to it, even if it resulted in often sort of superficial or artificial changes. The fact is they had to pay attention to it. They had to take it into account. And to me, did that contribute to the context for some of what's happening now? I think it did. I don't think that means that it's about us or that we should take responsibility. But it, to me, is an example of something we're doing actually having an effect, which is hopefully what we want when it comes to foreign policy making, right? I think that the interesting thing, though, is that we're talking, for example, about this U.S. GCC Strategic Forum. I see this in a slightly different way, because we had the Gulf Security Dialogue in the previous decade. And the Gulf Security Dialogue was essentially dealing with the same issues as this strategic forum. But we were forced, essentially, to deal with the Gulf states one by one. Not because that's what we wanted to do, but because they didn't want to come together as a group to do this. And what you're seeing now is that they want now to come together as a group to deal with us. I don't think that reflects greater trust in us. I think that actually reflects a sense on their part that they need to band together not only to deal with countries like Iran and so forth, but to deal with the United States right now because they're not sure of what we're up to. And it's interesting to me to see that this change has happened not because we were pushing for political reform in the last decade. This change has happened because they're not sure of our commitment to the security issues, whether it's Iran or whether it's other security issues in the region. So I don't think that this issue of balancing democracy promotion and balancing our security interests is really all it's cracked up to be. I think that's probably easier than some of the other challenges we have in the region right now.
Thank you very much. Hala.
Sure.
Thank you. I have a question to the panel. Basically, I'll address Ellen. What one hears from Tehran these days is that the regime is seriously looking at the possibility of coming to an understanding. I'm saying understanding, not agreement, over the nuclear issue. Let's say it happens. What is the reaction of the Gulf states going to be to that? Because Iran then would emerge as really a very strong power. I'm not saying the strong power, a very strong power in the region, number one. Number two, how will Israel react to that? And would then the perception be that, once again, you cannot trust the United States? I mean, it abandoned the Shah of Iran, it abandoned Mubarak. I'm just talking about the perception. And an anecdote, Nathan, when the heads of states met in Guadeloupe before the Iranian Revolution, the understanding in Iran among the population and the revolutionaries was that the Shah is finished. When you said that, they met in Tahrir, when they met, the nuance was that they are here to promote. So you see the different perception. So how wouldn't then they turn more to Saudi Arabia would welcome, let's say, the intervention of Saudi Arabia in Bahrain? Wouldn't they go back relying on themselves and not necessarily on an outside power like the U.S.?
Well, I think that in the Gulf, the reactions to an agreement that is not, to an understanding that perhaps is an interim step to a more formal agreement, will generate a very, confusing reaction, I think. There were certainly parts of the elites in the Gulf that would be hugely relieved to know that we are not heading to a war that would affect them as well. Obviously, we hear that some leaders in the Gulf would have a willingness to contemplate military action as something that would resolve the situation for once and for all, but they've thought that before, and they learned, at least we learned, that sometimes those military interventions have huge unintended consequences. So I think in the public and in the business community there would be relief, and I think in government circles there would be a little bit uncertainty. I've always felt that the Gulf countries are nervous that if the Iran problem is resolved, that the United States would actually consider Iran the more important strategic partner in the region, and they would feel a loss of status and influence if you were to get to that level of true normalization of U.S.-Iran relations. But I think your scenario falls quite a bit short of a true, successful diplomatic negotiation. Do you want to do Israel?
I think I agree with Ellen on the Gulf. I think the prospect of an understanding that falls short of, say, stopping Iran's nuclear program, period, is not welcomed for the most part by leaders in the Gulf. I think, in a sense, they would have preferred the U.S. sort of deal with this more forcefully, even though the U.S. maybe was not so excited about that. I think for Israel, I think the attitude is pretty similar. They share the concerns the Gulf states do about Iran's nuclear program. I think their view is that. And I say they, I mean this is a diverse society, obviously, with lots of different opinions. But if you take the current government, their view of the red lines is probably more along the lines of full suspension of enrichment and so forth, which is not. It's not clear to me that's the view of the red lines that the Obama administration has. And so I think their view is that this kind of understanding would leave Iran with too dangerous a residual nuclear military capability. What actual reaction that would provoke, whether they would still contemplate a military action, for example, I don't know. I'm not sure they know either. This is not necessarily the sort of issue you're going to decide in advance because you have to wait and see what happens. And then there was a second part of your question, though, but now I don't remember what it was.
The second question was if we come to this kind of understanding, would reaction in the whole region be that we should turn inwards rather than rely on an outside power, which is not reliable?
My answer is absolutely yes. In fact, I think you see that happening already because of what I was talking about, this perception that U.S., not just influence, but real U.S. interest in the region is declining. You already see a willingness to take matters into their own hands. You mentioned the Saudi intervention in Bahrain. We could point to the earlier Saudi intervention in Yemen. We were seeing, I think, more activity focused on, say, Syria and so forth. So I think the answer is yes, that you'll see. I don't think it will be black and white. I think you'll see a lot of hedging behavior. We've talked about the possibility, for example, that these states may seek their own sort of different kinds of nuclear programs. They'll have to decide what their security relations with Iran will be. And so you'll see, I think, a lot of this kind of hedging.
Can I just add one slightly more positive dimension to the scenario? If part of the understanding with Iran would lead to the Iran having its nuclear fuel supplied by an international consortium, if it would mean that they ship out of the country so that you're internationalizing the fuel cycle, I think some of the Gulf countries would actually find that a very worthy idea. The Saudis have been willing to fund one of these international consortia, and I think the UAE could participate. I could imagine a regional, in the long run, moving towards a regional fuel bank or some kind of an internationally monitored institution that would support the nuclear energy programs of these countries and be somewhat of a reliable safeguard to prevent them from turning into national military programs.
All right, should we go to questions Mona, you've got the magic wand. Where should we start? Yes, sure. Could you please identify yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Laura Schultz from USAID. Thank you for the excellent panel and really interesting conversation. I was wondering if I could ask for any comment on the issue of demographics and how the U.S. is faring in terms of really understanding the very significant and severe demographic issues in the region, which of course are not new, but were certainly elevated by some of the transitions that took place in the region, both in places like Egypt, but as well Yemen and Saudi Arabia. How are we doing in terms of understanding these demographic pressures? And I mean, to Ellen's point, and the less is more, are there things that we can be doing better from government, from the outside, from the donor community to understand and perhaps engage on these issues? Or is it something that is not kind of that shouldn't that we should tread more carefully on?
Well, thanks, Laura. I think that, first of all, some of the most original work on Middle East demographics is being done by Rich Sincata, who's sitting next to the door, who really has looked at the kind of demographic footprints of Middle Eastern countries and really flagged years before it happened that Tunisia was moving more than any other Arab country to a favorable demographic pattern where the number, where the bottom of the pyramid wasn't as wide. I mean, if you think of Yemen as a country that's a very flat pyramid and Tunisia starting to look more like a Western country. But, demographics plays out over a very long time. I don't think there's any question that people in the U.S. government understand that job creation and youth unemployment are acute, immediate, high-priority issues. It's not clear to me, and you would know better, that if I look at AID's programming overall, that there's enough attention in the money side being given to job creation programs. But so I think that the underlying logic and knowledge of the demographic story, I think, is understood. Sometimes, however, I fear that we have generalized it to the point where we just think that every Arab country has this huge youth bulge that is sort of choking them, when in fact there's a more differentiated story. Tunisia is moving in a more favorable direction where there's fewer young people coming up, that their job creation burden is actually going to ease sooner than other countries does because they did their family planning thing earlier and more successfully than other countries. But there are other countries for whom it's going to only emerge in the coming years that the job creation burden is going to be absolutely dominant in the economic policy making of those countries. So I think, in principle we get it, but I don't see it reflected in the aid programming.
Yes, up here in the front. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Tua. There clearly is a consensus that the ability of the states in the Middle East have increased their ability to maneuver and so on and assert themselves and what they want and the terms on which they want it. On the other hand, their ability has also been diminished. Number one, with the end of the Cold War, they don't have an alternative party that they can turn to for assistance. And I don't think the Chinese are going to fill that gap. Secondly, they're very much in need of the kind of sophisticated developmental aid, technology, and so on that we're kind of that we're exceptional at, better probably than most any other country. So they will have to adjust their policies in no sense. Now the question is, to what extent can we do things to increase their desire and willingness to accept that assistance with their need for it? And it seems to me, given the fact that these countries don't have any alternatives and that there are other big powers, I'm thinking primarily the Security Council and some others, it seems to me that there's a greater possibility for great power consensus on how to achieve greater stability in the region. And this will, in a sense, make it easier for us to accept adjustments in our policies that we otherwise might not. And I'm thinking particularly of the Palestinian issue, difficulties making Israel make some hard decisions, and the Iranian issue, but there are other things.
I mean, I'm not sure, in the case of the Israelis, that our capacity and leverage in this particular arena is going to increase. In fact, I would argue it's going to diminish because, and this is why I asked Nathan about the Egyptian-Israeli relationship, just as an example. If the Egyptian-Israeli relationship begins to fray, no serious Israeli policy maker is going to be able to sustain additional concessions closer to home with a deeply divided Palestinian polity. That's number one. Number two, the absence of strong authoritative leaders, which was critically important to the back-in-the-day strategy in two ways: to support Palestinian concessions at the table and to reach out to the Israelis, which was true in the 90s. That strong and authoritative leadership in the Arab world doesn't exist. I mean, the King of Jordan tries to sponsor negotiations in Amman because it's the right thing to do, and he understands the security and political threats. Those go nowhere, and he's unable to do anything with respect to follow on. The Arab Initiative, what will its fate be in a region that is much more amenable now and vulnerable to rising currents of public opinion and Islamist public opinion, particularly on an issue like Jerusalem? I see the devolution of power creating not only a devolution of information, but a devolution of authority, particularly on this issue. So I am not one of those who believe that the Arab Spring revolt, awakening, whatever you want to call it, is going to have a positive impact on the prospects for Arab-Israeli peacemaking. I think it's going to make a complicated situation, which Nathan alluded to, was all but dead a year ago, much more difficult.
How about the need of China, India, oil, and for stability in that region?
Well, I mean, that,
Investing in a U.S. leading term.
yeah, I'm not, no. The issue of leading from behind or leading from up front, I think our capacity to affect events in this region, in my judgment, has significantly diminished.
Aaron, I'm going to take one last question, if you don't mind. We are running out of time. But really a brief question. My colleague,
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Cynthia Schneider from Georgetown University. Thanks for a great panel. I want to come back to the interests and values issue, which I think you addressed with great subtlety. I've recently been involved in a public-private partnership in Egypt with a private company called Share the Mic and the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, bringing musical groups there and recently hosting an American Idol-style, contest called Sing Egyptian Women, which was hugely successful. Tons of people turned out for everything, very varied contestants, very varied audience. A Christian girl ended up winning, but nobody knew that. They just liked her singing. Our idea was to elevate women at a time when they're so absent from the public space in Egypt, and people again and again thanked us for raising music and women when they're both under siege. I've worked in the State Department. I know you're all going, oh, culture, but what good could that do? But that's not what they think in Egypt. But in terms of what we could do, and our experience was if we delivered something of value on the ground, people totally appreciated it, and there was no anti-Americanism at all, totally the opposite. In terms of what could happen right now, something that I believe is urgently needed for the upcoming elections in Egypt, if they do indeed upcome, is serious monitoring and also addressing the issue of Article 28, this infamous thing in the provisional constitution.
Nationalism rising. It's very difficult to make this argument in an Egyptian context, in a place where essentially the demand of the opposition has been steadily for judicial oversight of the elections. And so because all the emphasis has been on that, calling for a robust international role is something that doesn't have a purchase across the Egyptian political spectrum with the government and with the opposition. So for that reason, we can talk about it all we want, and we did with the parliamentary elections. And the results in terms of what international presence there was much more meager, I think, than we would have liked.
Before thanking my panelists, let me make two announcements. One, that on May 3rd, that there is going to be a debate discussion here between Amr Hamzawi, who is a Liberal member of Parliament, and Jane Harman, the president of the Wilson Center, moderated by Michelle Dunn, the head of the Rafiq Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council. And on May 14, we are hosting a half-day meeting on whether women in the Arab Spring have been marginalized politically and economically, and we are bringing a number of women from the region. You're most welcome to join us for these two meetings. And Aaron, you have one last thing to say? Okay, let me just thank the panelists and the moderator. And this is what we offer you at the Wilson Center. Thank you for coming.